To understand the state of the nation on the basis of scientific research and surveys, which Stats SA conducts now and again, I'm joined by the Statistician General, Resenga Maluleke, who is with us to tell us a bit more. And we're inviting you to join the network with your comments using the hashtag the Modise Network. Dr. Maluleke, always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much that you are joining us. Let's look at the vulnerability survey that you conducted most recently, well, at least a couple of years ago, given the number of South Africans who depend on grants. I'm talking about children, people with disabilities and so forth. What is the broad state of vulnerability in our nation?
Firstly, is that Stats SA conducts surveys and monthlies and compilations. So we release about 260 reports per annum, which gives us a report almost every day. Now, with specific reference, let us look at the general household survey that we conducted latest 2018, and we made the results available recently. It indicates that grants have become the second most important issue in relation to income, household income. And when you look at that, salaries are leading at about 60%, grants are sitting at about 20%, 19.9% to be exact. And then out of that, you look at the Eastern Cape, for example, that is highly dependent on grants than any other province in the country. There are remittances as well, which the money that almost all of us from bigger cities send to our parents, they account for about 10%. Now, when you look at grants, while they are not sustainable in themselves as a nation to go about depending on them and accounting for 20%, they have actually taken a number of people at household level, at person level, out of hunger. So with the number of those who are receiving grants increasing from years back, 2002, going up to 2018, the number of those that are vulnerable to hunger and at household level as well is declining quite fast.
But of course, it is dependent on the money that comes from the fiscus, isn't it? From the taxpayers.
Certainly.
Which implies, therefore, if the number is increasing of the beneficiaries, that you have to increase the amounts collected. And in order to increase the amounts collected via taxes, you've got to increase the economic output. And we know, most recently, you said, Stats SA, that our economy is contracting or is not growing, and the jobs are actually declining in number. So what kind of scenario are we facing then?
Firstly, let us look at the economy in general. A strong economy has the propensity to create jobs. A weaker economy doesn't create jobs. And when it's even contracting, it certainly will create challenges to the citizenry. The recent figures of the first quarter of 2019 indicate that we have contracted by 3.2%. And if you look in the area of mining and manufacturing, and generally your mining and manufacturing are heavily dependent on electricity. The manufacturing of food, for example, in the same quarter, created jobs. As you will remember that we have recovered about 14,000 jobs in the manufacturing in the same quarter. But the number of unemployed people is sitting at 6.2 million persons in the first quarter of 2019, which account for 27.6%. But those are the ones that are actively looking for employment for 4 days a week, for 4 weeks in a row, in the rule that we call 4x4, according to the International Labour Organization. When you look at those that didn't look for employment, the discouraged work seeker, there are about 3 million. And there are others who didn't look for employment for other reasons other than being discouraged. That's about 900,000, closer to 1 million. So you have 9.9 million persons as of the first quarter of 2019 who are unemployed, which accounts for about 38%, which we call the expanded unemployment rate.
So if one wants to deal with numbers in that fashion, it would be reasonable, it would be fair to say 38% of South Africans are without jobs. are unemployed?
Certainly, certainly.
Okay, because it's always confusing. You know, there's 27% here, there's 38%, and we never know which number to go with.
What we do, you will remember that the country in the National Development Plan has adopted the lower bound poverty line as a way of tracking poverty. So you usually have three lines. You have the food poverty line, you have the lower bound poverty line, you have the upper bound poverty line. We can deal with those later. But as regards unemployment, the country has adopted as its official definition the narrow definition, which many nations use, for purposes of the fact that you have to account firstly for people who are actively looking for employment in that 4x4 rule as advised by the ILO. And South Africa is not the only nation that does that.
Well, let's look at the number of people who are employed, right? And of that number of people who are employed, look at the number of those who pay tax, because we may define poverty however way we want, but you can be employed and still be living under the poverty line.
Certainly. What happens is employment is defined as being employed by somebody else or being working for yourself, self-employment for purposes of earning a wages or a salary. And out of that, there are so many people, including those that are employed in the formal sector, who are below the tax threshold. Look at the recent announcements by SARS that if you are earning about 500,000 rands, you don't necessarily have to file tax returns. So that's your tax threshold. And then you can look at how many people would be earning at that threshold nationally. Because firstly, about a third of those that are employed are in the domestic workership as well as in the informal sector. So when you look at those numbers, out of the 16.2 million people, already you have people that are far below the tax threshold.
So of the 16 million of employed people, how many would you say pay tax? Income tax at least?
It's not a matter I would want to speculate now. I would rather leave that to SARS.
Okay, all right, yeah. we'll leave it at that. But it does help concentrate the mind in a way, all right, and have an appreciation that you have 9.9 million people unemployed. And how many people living on grants or depending on social grants, for instance?
Yeah.
How many would you say? What is the number?
Firstly, we are saying that out of the 57.73 million persons in South Africa, 60% of those in households depend on salaries.
Okay, and
only 20% depends on on grants. And in terms of the number, I would rather unpack it at some stage. But certainly, you don't look at persons when you look at grants, for example, because a grant or a salary doesn't support one person. It supports a household. That's why you need to look at it at household level.
So then the poverty levels in the country, what is the threshold? How do you measure them?
Firstly, when you want to measure poverty, you look at two surveys, for example. One is the income and expenditure survey. So you need to know what gets earned and how the population spends. And the other one, you need to look at the living conditions survey so that you can understand the whole issue of ownership of assets and everything. Now, the two of them assist you to come up with the poverty index, because poverty is an index. Now, speaking of poverty, the lower bound poverty survey that we are tracking, 40% of the population as of 2015 remains under the lower bound poverty line. And while we can talk of prices from time to time because we release our CPI, but certainly as regards poverty, we can go up to 2015. About 25% of the population is what we call falling under the food poverty line of in our society. And these are people who have to make a decision as to whether to buy food or to buy other necessities. And these are people that could potentially be vulnerable to hunger. Whereas the 40% that is in the lower bound, which we track in the National Development Plan, the NDP, is actually rising. Coming out of 2011, we're sitting at about 38.6%. So we have risen a bit to about 40% up to 2015.
And unfortunately now, you're citing the 2015 numbers, right? And one would think with the contracting economy and a whole number of recent challenges that we have in our society, that number may be rising, but you're not able to tell us. Why is that? Why haven't you conducted any further surveys in that regard?
Statistics South Africa hasn't conducted an income and expenditure survey, as well as the living conditions survey coming out of 2013-2014 for purposes of computing a poverty index. And the reasons are that as a nation we do not have money to fund these programs.
Well, we've got a plan. We don't have money to conduct surveys, so how will we know what we must deal with, I mean, as a nation?
There is a challenge. Always, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And these are choices that certainly have to be made at some stage, what we fund. There are a lot more people poor out there. We need to fund them, but also you need to know what you are funding.
Well, we've spoken about money in terms of the social grants, right? But there are other benefits that hopefully mitigate against poverty that exist, other measures that exist in our society, things like free housing, I would like to believe, and free education. Are you able to use that to see the extent to which these benefits mitigate against poverty levels in the country? Free education, free housing, if you can give us a sense.
We have about 67% of our population that is receiving free electricity and free water coming out of the municipalities. 20,000 of about 26,000 schools are what we call fee-free schools. So children can get to school and are allowed to go to school, and government compensates for that. We also have children that benefit from feeding schemes in schools. All these form part of what we call the multidimensional poverty index that we measure as Statistician. Nationally, internationally, other countries do the same. But we also include employment as a country. So we have what we call the SAMPI, the South African Multidimensional Poverty Index. It has been declining when we look at how government is intervening. Earlier on, I spoke about how government intervenes in the form of grants, and intervening with all this basket of social wage. We have declined from 18% coming out of 2006 to about 11% in 2009. And as of 2015, we are sitting at about 7% of the poor, those who live below the poverty line. And if you look at that number, it's almost at the same level as the global level where other countries internationally are intervening.
Resenga Maluleke is the Statistician General. He's talking to us about the different surveys that they conduct and the information that's coming out of that, which should inform how the economy of South Africa is managed. We'll be continuing our conversation with him after the break.